Does France's grand plan to go green squeeze out the little guy? On the day President Emmanuel Macron announced his long-awaited energy policy for the decade to come, it was with one eye to that yellow vest protest movement against fuel tax hikes that's cropped up the last 3 weeks here in France, an anti-tax movement that's leaderless, where last Saturday a white middle class that feels forgotten descended on the capital with violent clashes at times on the Champs-Élysées. Are they off the grid of policymakers, these protesters, in an energy transition plan that now includes last-minute promises of infrastructure spending and caps on fuel tax hikes? Can Macron restore the connection with people forced out of big cities because of high real estate prices, who've endured cuts in money-losing public transport networks, and who rely on their cars to get around? How to wean ourselves off fossil fuels without further eroding stagnant spending power? Key to that question is how France intends to honor its pledge to lower its huge overdependency on nuclear power. Can it afford, at this point in time, to really go green? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Macron and the yellow vests. With us, Henri Landès, Executive Director at the Good Planet Foundation and who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Welcome to Farid Badash, Managing Director at BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, a consultancy headquartered in San Francisco, you say?
Yeah, and I work from Paris.
And you work from Paris, which is a great place to work from. Benjamin Amar of the CGT Trade Union for the Paris suburb area of Val-de-Marne.
Of course.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
And Fabrice Filippo teaches philosophy and sustainability at the Mines Telecom Business School in Paris. Author in French of L'écologie autoritaire. How would you translate that? Authoritarian ecology?
Yes, right.
Okay.
That's right.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24 debate. Now, it was a long-awaited plan that Emmanuel Macron rolled out this Tuesday, a long-awaited plan that had, well, some last-minute amendments in view of the protest movement that has been going on and challenging the president over the past weeks. Erna Gunke has more.
From addressing climate change to crisis control. In a speech originally aimed at detailing France's future clean energy strategy, the French president began with a highly anticipated reaction to the so-called Yellow Vests movement.
This movement has given rise to major demonstrations and also unacceptable violence. I have understanding for these fellow citizens, but I will not give anything to those who want destruction and disorder, because the Republic is both public order and the free expression of opinions.
But for the protesters who demanded the government revoke its fuel tax, Emmanuel Macron's response is unlikely to appease their anger. Walking a delicate line between showing empathy with the demonstrators and sticking to his government's energy strategy, the French president refused to renounce plans to accelerate the transition to clean energy.
We must therefore hear people's anger and alarm, but we must not do so by renouncing our responsibilities for today and tomorrow, because there is also an environmental alarm. I would go further to say it is the social and territorial inequalities that many of our fellow citizens are rightly denouncing today that are often coupled with environmental inequality.
Still, the French president did offer concessions. He vowed to review diesel taxes regularly in consideration of the global oil market. Macron also called for a 3-month-long national consultation to better address the Yellow Vest movement's anger and to work towards concrete solutions.
Henri Landès, did Emmanuel Macron give all he could give to those Yellow Vest protesters?
Well, I would ask the question, did he give all he can to the environmental transition and to everyone in France? Because the fact is those that are protesting with some very specific preoccupations, but it's a reflection of an inability to join social and environmental progress for decades now. And so the fact is, no, I do not believe he gave all that he could to either one. But I wouldn't separate them, because the truth of the matter is we'll all do much better once we have a more environmentally friendly society. But that means, and that requires, that we address social inequality and the ability to accompany and to participate everyone in this environmental transition. And obviously we're seeing today that that's not possible. So we need to think first, how do we get everyone secure enough financially, secure in their social and in their economic needs, and then we do the transition. Even though I'm going to be much more attentive to much more ambitious measures that Emmanuel Macron, in my opinion, should take on environment.
And we're going to talk about the measures in a moment. In his speech, Macron calling for a social contract for the 21st century, a nod to Enlightenment-era philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau that, well, failed to impress the yellow vests that were out manning a checkpoint. They were filmed here in the rain in Alsace by partner station France 2.
We're very disappointed. We're waiting for him to say something to calm us down.
He says nothing about us. We asked to be able to eat until the end of the month. It's not complicated. We're not against ecology.
He wants to try to buy us for peanuts and then take our money. It won't work, and the movement will grow even more.
Fabrice Flippo, what do you make of this movement?
Well, you refer to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau was strongly against luxury, and it was because luxury will lead to different classes of citizens, and it will be impossible to make a common law, and that's the illustration of that. A big part of the French population is highly dependent on car, because of land planning mainly, and because of the unavailability of private shops or private services and also public services. So they need the car, and Emmanuel Macron is one of those people who decrease those services, and now he's increasing the taxes. So Emmanuel Macron underlines all the time the meaning of the policies. He underlines that political people, they should be meaningful, but this transition is meaningless for a large part of the population.
It's meaningless?
It's meaningless because if you want to do the transition really, then you look at real obstacle, not
it's not a holistic
fantasies.
Approach.
It's not realistic. It's not realistic. If you look at the polls made from ADEME, French agency on the perception on transition, this agency asked the people what do you need to go further on the energy transition, and more than 50% is to make equitable effort. And my English not so good, but
yeah,
sorry.
So that everyone pays their fair share.
Yes, exactly. And with this policy, Macron's policy is maybe 90% on the poor, nothing on the wealthy. Yes.
There's this feeling, if you've been and spoken with some of those yellow vest protesters, that really there's a disconnect between two Frances. We saw it in a stark manner on Saturday when they descended on the Capitol. There were arguments, discussions, people talking at cross purposes. The Parisians, who don't own a car, and these yellow vests protesters who do. What do you make of it, Benjamin?
No, indeed, you say that this movement is an anti-tax movement. I don't think so. I think you've got a lot of demonstrators, very different in this movement. And for my trade union, I can connect some how can I say? For example, when you've got a lot of yellow vests who talk about the necessity to increase the salaries. And that's a fact. 50% of the French worker has a salary under 1,700 euros by month.
Yeah.
50% of the...
Yeah, take-home pay 1,700 is the median salary
Yeah,
in France.
of
So
course.
if you make more,
Yeah.
you're in the top 50% of earners.
That's true. And 50% of the French retired people, every month, they had less than 1,200 euros. That's a fact. So you've got a problem of cost of life. And you can say to the working class or middle class, you will be the only to pay for the ecological emergency. They can accept that when you know that big companies, airplane companies, for example, has no tax in the kerosene,
yeah.
and that the ships, for example, the ship's oil has no tax. When you say that, there's a problem. People has the things that the government wants only that they pay for the ecological emergency, and that can be the solution. When you do that, you make the disconnection between the social problem and the ecological problem. So this movement is a social movement.
And the fact that they reject the trade unions, that they reject the political parties, as a trade unionist, how do you feel about that?
Now, indeed, you've got a part of the Yellow Vests who are inspired by the far right, But other Yellow Vests, we can talk with them. So I think that the trade union has to hear and to connect with the Yellow Vests, who shares the social analysis of the problem of salaries, the problem of the cost of life. We have to connect with them, not with the Yellow Vests who are intoxicated by the far right. But we have to talk with the Yellow Vest who shares our point of view. This is very important. Emmanuel Macron is a servant of the big company, of the majors. This is the problem. And his ecological politics is, how can I say, is established by this way.
Farid Badash, do you share that view?
Partly that's right. What's been shared up to now. Just want to say that this carbon tax was enacted in 2014, prior to President Macron, basically. And year by year, there is this principle to increase taxes. And it's fair to say that at the time when this tax was enacted, there was not enough consultation or debate to define how to ensure that that would be based and driven by good inclusion of everything which has been said. So I fully agree with all these aspects. And now it's conflicting with an approach and some perception that basically increases the gap. That said, it doesn't mean the two things are not important. One, the big picture remains the same. It's very important to drive change to, transition to low carbon economies. That's the big picture. That's important. That needs to be supported by a social contract. Every country, carbon taxes are applied across more than 50 countries, and every country has to find the right way to ensure that there is a right distribution and that all these perceptions are well included. I like the example of British Columbia and Canada, where basically they decided that some of the money collected is then, given to the poorest very directly, so they don't have any impact on their purchasing power.
Yeah, the feeling is with this carbon tax that the money's just going to go to help
That's right.
help against the budget deficit. It's not going to go towards green transition.
Yeah, and right now you're collecting 7 billion of taxes this year, just attached to these taxes, and transparency on where this money is going and how there is good transfer of that money to the poorest is important.
I want the panel's reaction. Macron directly called for it to be not a choice between, as many have put it in the last 2 weeks, those worried about the end of the month and those worried about the end of the world. Sometimes, says the French president, it's the same citizens expressing both points of view.
You can't be pro-environment on Monday and on Tuesday denounce the rise of fuel prices. You can't vote on a carbon tax a few years ago and now stand against the rise of fuel prices. May I remind you that this tax was voted on in 2009, 2014, and 2015 with the support of many politicians of different affiliations.
Henri Landès?
The reason why it also didn't work in 2009 is because the Constitutional Council estimated that there were too many exonerations for big businesses in the planned carbon tax. So for him to mention the 2009 carbon tax and say we have to not make the mistake this time, he's unfortunately making the mistake.
But does he have a point that we're all a little bit schizophrenic in France and that we want to have more spending power and we want a greener planet?
I think that's a rhetoric to kind of pass through in a forceful way. Probably there's schizophrenia for a lot of people, but I think that it's not necessarily the same people that are going to protest against having a low ability for the cost of life and to respond to that, and the same people that are going to talk about the end of the world. The problem is that it's an issue of can people contribute everybody to this environmental transition, and obviously they can't. So that shouldn't be a rhetoric anymore. He should recognize that obviously a big part of the population is not able to pay for what is necessary for them to move around and to meet their daily needs. So once you realize that, any new fiscal measures need to be integrated into a global reform of the fiscal system. And what needs to be done is look at where you have margin for maneuvering in reducing financial pressure and taxes elsewhere, for example, on capital and on machines that have been replacing humans for the last decades, and where we're not taxing there, and reduce taxes on working, and then put more taxes on pollution. But you can't just keep the same system and then add on taxes for environment and then not expect people to say, well, I don't want this new tax on environment. And that creates this tension that does not need to exist.
Doesn't need to exist?
No, but indeed, I think
Do you agree with what
I
just
agree
said?
with a lot of
that
things.
we don't need to have this tension between...
We shouldn't.
Of course, but I talk about the difference between the tax for the citizen and the tax for the majors. But Emmanuel Macron has no lesson to give. He forgot one thing. Last spring, he destroyed with his own railway reform 9,000 of kilometers of the French railway. 9,000 kilometers. He forgot that. The only thing that Emmanuel Macron said to working class and middle class is disrespect, superiority syndrome. You know, his speaker, Benjamin Griveaux, was laughing about French people who smoke cigarettes and drive with diesel. That this government is always in the behavior of disrespect, you know, superiority syndrome of superior class with the citizen. And the yellow vest demonstration is the consequence of that. Okay, so I think Emmanuel Macron has no lesson to give us.
Fabrice Philpot, is the president out of touch?
Yes, I think you have to understand what.
I mean, he wasn't raised in Paris. He was raised in the provinces in Amiens. Are you surprised at the?
Very Parisian, no?
Yes. No, it's upper class. It seems that he doesn't. He simply doesn't understand what's the condition.
Doesn't understand.
No, because the speech is out of reality.
Yeah, of course.
You have to understand what poverty means in a rich country. What poverty means in a rich country is that you need a lot of money only not to be poor.
Of course.
It's very different in a developing country. In France, when you want to have food, you need to drive 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers. When you need to go to the mayor, same thing. And it's very different in a country with less dependency on car and on roads.
All right, so when we come back in the France 24 debate, we're going to have a look at what is in that 10-year plan for France's energy transition and what can work. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate and the look at how the French president is answering that yellow vest leaderless movement that's protesting fuel tax hikes Now, it had long been planned on the calendar. This was the day where the government rolls out its 10-year energy plan. We're going to go into that with Henri Landès, Executive Director of the Good Planet Foundation, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Farid Badash, Managing Director at BSR, the Business for Social Responsibility Consultancy. We're with Benjamin Amar of the French Trade Union, the CGT, and Fabrice Flippo, who teaches at philosophy and sustainability at Mines Telecom Business School, and the author in French of L'écologie autoritaire, authoritarian ecology. Fabrice Flippo talking in part one of our discussion about how the fact that there isn't a holistic approach, right? When they roll out these energy plans, here I'll put it to you, Farid Badash. How do you roll out when you roll out a 10-year plan for energy? How do you roll one out that takes into account rising real estate prices, the infrastructure problems of the crumbling rail network, all the things that have come up with this Yellow Vest movement?
These are great questions and issues. You cannot.
Is it doable? Can you come up with a real grand plan?
You build scenarios. Definitely. You build scenarios, and with scenarios, you try to understand the different dynamics. There are tools for that. You try to calibrate that with, climate strategies and climate objectives. And now everyone needs to work with the trajectory of 1.5 degree scenario, and out of that, you understand the implications of that. And through scenarios, you try to really work on the tensions. And of course, the questions are you manage the transitions. We developed some guides for that. For example, just one called with B Team and Just Transition Center called Just Transition. We was just released 2 months ago, just to support exactly the way you need to foresee and anticipate how you involve communities, workers in transitions needed to face the huge disruptions needed by climate transitions.
We're in top-down France, where power is very centralized. How come this isn't enough of a grand plan?
Well, in certain countries, Sweden, for example, when you call public authorities to have assistance, socially and economic help, they take into account your energy dependence and your expenses in the energy sector or for your transportation in your household. It's just an example of where they've looked at all of the different expenses and the different needs of a citizen and taken into account energy and climate issues right from the beginning. Whereas here, we've kind of added on an energy issue to a fiscal system that needs to be reformed. I mentioned earlier that we need to tax capital and machinery, for example, and reduce taxes on working, for example. Now, what we need to do at this issue of centralization versus decentralization, energy and environmental transitions tend to go quicker when you decentralize power and authority because there is a huge aspect of relocalizing the economy that is synonymous to more environmental friendliness, more harmony with nature, etc. And if we centralize things too much, then you don't adapt the economy and people's activities and their needs to the local specificities. And there's nothing more intrinsic
So
with
France is doomed, is what you're saying?
No,
because
I'm saying that
we're so centralized.
France is not as...
Come
France
on, we've
has
been
the
talking about
potential to be
decentralization for decades. It's never happened.
Well, we've been talking about environmental transition for decades. We haven't done that yet either.
All right.
So we should maybe realize that we have some obstacles that are to get connected and overcome them once and for all.
The government's 10-year plan includes big infrastructure projects. Those infrastructure projects include setting up financial incentives for those who want to buy electric cars, investing in geothermal heating and biogas, closing all of the country's coal plants by the year 2022. Yes, that's right. France still boasts 4 coal-fired energy plants. I want to ask you about this. Huh?
Only 4.
Only 4, but let me ask
almost
you.
nothing.
Benjamin Amar, 4 coal-fired plants. You're a trade unionist. Your job is to defend jobs. So is it a tough one for you? Are you for or against closing these coal-fired plants?
No, but I think the announce of Emmanuel Macron push how can I say this announce talk about solution in 20 years. It's very long. That's not enough. There is no ambition in the ecological subject and also in the social subject. And you talk about the problem of the centralization of the power. I think maybe the problem is not the centralization, but the imagination of this power. Emmanuel Macron, when the subject is not to serve majors, he can have he lose his imagination. For example, we can come back to the 5.5 tax for the network transport. It will be very good for the cost of life and very good for the ecological emergency. But this kind of solution, Emmanuel Macron don't want to listen this. He said to the Yellow Vest, I listened to you, but I think the left here of Emmanuel Macron is not so good. He had a problem with his left side. Okay, so indeed we've got ideas. There are solutions to connect the social subject and the ecological subject. But Emmanuel Macron seemed to be unable to do this connection.
We haven't even begun to broach something that's also the political third rail in France, which is nuclear power. Maybe we should talk about that before we move on, because we talked about the closing of the coal-fired plants. France has 58 nuclear power plants. It's second only to the United States in terms of numbers of those plants, and first in terms of reliance. Nearly 3/4 of the country's energy needs are atomic-powered. Now, that's great for consumers who enjoy lower energy bills, but there's a hidden cost. The dismantling of reactors, which were, by the way, originally built to last 30 years, costs an estimated 75 billion euros to dismantle. That's a conservative figure. President Macron sticking to his plan to close the oldest one of those plants. That's Fessenheim. That's near the German border, operational since 1977. By the way, built in a seismic zone of the Vosges Mountains. He has announced he's going to close that one. What do you make when it comes to the nuclear issue, Fabrice Philippot, and the way that the French approach it?
First thing, you say 75% of French energy comes from nuclear power. It's not energy. It's electricity.
Electricity, good, yeah.
Yes, but almost everybody does this mistake. And if you see that it's only electricity, then you see that France relies on fossil energy like every other country. There's a little difference, but not that much. And that's the first thing. Second thing, if you look at French policy in renewable energy, almost nothing for 40 years. New renewable energy. Renewable energy in France, it's all biomass for countryside or hydroelectricity. That's all. So what wind or solar, there has been no real policy.
It started now
in France.
It started in the last 2 decades.
Not really. We have maybe 1% of photovoltaics. It's a very small figure in France. You have to realize that. And
so the French aren't green, is what you're saying?
No, they're not green.
Why?
No.
Why are you describing Sweden and all that? Why are the French not as green?
Sweden has
and Germany, and we'll talk more about Germany later. But
has built a real plan for decarbonization.
So what is it? Is it something about the French that they don't care as much?
Not only carbon tax, but biomass, but reorganization of the country. Everybody knows what carbon is in France. If you ask the Yellow Vest, they have heard of the risk of climate change, but where is the carbon exactly? Where are the solutions? It's very difficult for them to have a clear answer, and it's partly because of these big companies who want to be the solution, and because they are very big, they are not the solution, but they block every local solution. They block everything.
Farid Badash?
I just think that the problems attached to that is the capital spent in nuclear energy, which at some point, as part of the plan, need really to be.
Because the French like those big projects, don't they? They love big nuclear power plants.
And I said that's just not adapted to what's needed now. What's needed now is more to move to, energy.
Is it still that mindset right now? Because there was talk that this plan would unveil as many nuclear power. They didn't go that far, but there was one of the scenarios would have been that they would have just replaced all the nuclear power plants that are there now.
Well, by 2030, the plan intends to increase the share of renewables up to 30%, which is, probably insufficient. And interestingly, it's below actually what's expected by a lot of companies, which are actually working on plans, exploring ways to decarbonize their activities and have more ambition actually than what the government is suggesting. So that's actually an interesting problem when you look at what's the ambition of companies, what people want, because the yellow vest, by the way, when you look at them, when you listen to them, there is no or limited resistance toward anything related to. Everyone wants to support climate transition. Basically, the problem is not the objective, basically, but it's basically the way to get there. And this feeling of unfair transition in the way. But at the end of the day, there is that kind of consensus. And I think that's important to flag as part of that discussion.
Benjamin Hammer?
You talk about the fact that my trade union want to defend the jobs. That's true. But the CGT wants a public sector of energy, grouping all aspects of the subject. We want the comeback of state, the comeback of the public action. We don't want greenwashing. We want true public action in industry, in energy, we want also, the CGT is for the local industrialization with little scales. This is the future. But in France, Emmanuel Macron, like Nicolas Sarkozy or François Hollande, has no strategy for industry and energy. That's a part of the problem.
As you've mentioned several times during this debate, there are big vested interests, right? One of those vested interests is the National Electric Company, EDF. It makes its money if we consume electricity. Oftentimes, we've had discussions on how to save the planet, and one of the best ways is to cut waste, to consume less. Of course, how much is being done on that score, since consuming less would mean less profit for those electric companies?
I don't think so. If the actor is not only the big major, but you've got a public action, we can build the ecological transition with connecting the social aspect. This could be like this. But you have to push the public action in the center of the situation.
Farid Badash.
Just 3 comments. One, let's not forget that the Paris Agreement is calling for good jobs as part of the transition. And when you look at any study you want, by 2030, the transition is expected to generate something like 60 million jobs. And that's important to flag. And then just my last comment on what has been said. As part of that transition, I think even these companies are changing their mindset, and increasingly they're exploring where to transfer their approaches, not just to, for example, ensuring that people maximize their bill, but instead they try to offer services to optimize consumption, to offer services to explore energy efficiency at home and things like that. So that's part of the way they try to basically transition their own activities because they understand that something is changing and that they need to adapt to that.
All right, my ears are still ringing from what Fabrice Philippot said about the French lacking in ambition when it comes to their energy transition. Let's look at what the neighbors are doing. In the 8 years since the Fukushima disaster, Germany has put itself to meeting its pledge to pull the plug on nuclear power, which, if you look at this graph, is down to just 10% of its energy mix. It was 20% when that accident occurred back in 2011. When you look at that graph, Henri Laurendès, your thoughts on how far could France go, not in the year 2035 or the year 2070 or whatever, but in the next 10 years? What could France do if it was more ambitious?
Well, there's a lot of debate about the energy transition in Germany, and I hear a lot of things that are very often caricatured, notably the fact that Germany has completely moved away from nuclear, or that France is hanging on to all of its nuclear and is not doing coal like Germany is because they've had to replace nuclear with coal. The truth is, Germany has increased drastically its renewable energy, like we've seen in this graph. They also have imported some electricity from France, from nuclear, and France imports also some coal electricity from Germany. So it's also a little bit of interaction between the two grids. And that's important to say in general in the beginning, so that we don't fall into the caricature. However, and this is where I might not agree with my colleague on my right here, is that there is a more decentralized energy system and more stakeholders that are providing electricity and energy in Germany than there are in France. And that has, to many thinkers on the energy transition in Germany, contributed to more local production and local consumption of energy. That does
so
not
instead
mean
of nationalizing the power company, you need to have several players who are in competition at the local level.
if the political will goes towards an energy transition, increasing renewable energy and local consumption and energy efficiency, because that's the most consensual in terms of what kind of scenario you need to do. But what I do want to mention is that Germany decided to go for a transition with a lot of clarity and a lot of political will. And you could be against the position, you could be against what the Général de Gaulle did in France with his nuclear energy development and his push for that. But in any case, they had a much more clear strategy in the type of energy that they wanted to develop in their country than we're seeing today. And unfortunately, and I think that you'll agree with me on this, is that we're kind of in the middle in France of going full out public sector dealing with the energy system and liberalizing and allowing for many stakeholders at the local level to emerge. And we've kind of been in the middle, and we're not really clear on that. And that's why you see EDF in the middle of a very difficult debate, in a very difficult situation of trying to help jobs transition. And the last thing I would like to say is you need to think about how the jobs transition, because you can't just do an additional transition economically. You need to help people that are working today in what you may think is the old energy system, if that's your position, into the new energy system. And if those jobs aren't converted and they're not accompanied, then it's very difficult to do that transition, and we're not able to do that yet.
We are between two seats.
Fabrice Philippot, what's your religion on this?
Yes, you say we need a lot of local producer, but not in concurrence, not in
competition with
not
one
in
another.
Competition.
Yeah.
There are many types of
Cooperatives.
organization, possible organization, and one in French, I don't know the translation in English, but it's a régie. It's a kind of municipally owned producing unit, and we need this type of governance. So because competition is leading to low quality in such case, so we need good quality. We need local control of energy, because every study, many studies show that when you control your energy, then you also control the level of consumption of energy. You control, you see all the issue, and if you just buy at a low cost energy in like this, it's not so good for transition.
One final question. I'll start with you, Farid Badash. Consensus on this panel that the statist approach of French high civil service, of politicians, that's still a big issue. What about among ordinary citizens? Are French citizens, is their mindset changing?
I think it is when you look just at polls and the level of interest in the way people embrace increasingly this question of energy transition. I think it's growing, it's increasing when you compare what we have today with what we had 10 years ago or something. So that mindset is changing.
So how will that translate at the polls? We have European elections in the spring.
That's a concern. That's a big concern. But if you translate that into other activities, for example, I'm sure that you have some yellow vests who basically decide to buy alternative sources of energy through local players like ENERCOP, for example, renewable energy. It's slightly more expensive, but some of the yellow vests think that that's part of the way they want to support transition. So some of these activities are happening, and interestingly, when recently the reason why President Macron had basically to strengthen a little bit his program on climate, and we have reasons to be critical about it, that's actually in response to the fact that at the end of the day, people want more greener economies at some point. So I think that's my... And would that translate into elections, a European election? I don't necessarily think so. And that's the fundamental dilemma of politicians, because on the one hand they need to address short-term needs, and that not necessarily translate into positive results in the election the next time. That's a big dilemma and conflict.
Short-term deadlines versus long-term ones, always the issue. I want to thank you, Farid Badache. I want to thank as well Fabrice Philippot, Benjamin Amar, Henri Landès. Stay with us though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Nicholas Rushworth.
Hi to you, Francois, and to everybody. And of course, the whole debate, Macron, the yellow vest, I wanted to show you one guy who has aligned himself with the movement. If we just go to our image here of this man, Alois Goury. Now, he is a poultry farmer in Bresse, in the eastern France, and he's been making the buzz today in lots of the media, local newspapers around France, because yes, he served his poultry, his chicken was served at the 11th of November Armistice Day commemoration dinner in the Élysées Palace. The Élysées Palace bought his produce, but he earns almost nothing. He lives on hundreds of euros a month. He has 77 hours a week to work. 1 week off, actually, in 3 years, he says. There you can see a local paper saying, "Mr. Macron, you do not deserve to eat my chicken." And so there you can see he's looking very nasty there. And this is all to do with an 8-minute ramble on Facebook. He's had 90,000 clicks on his just sheer. He just goes on saying, enough, this is just the beginning. We are totally fed up. So, he's saying, I can't make ends meet. I can't do it. And he actually, at one point, he turns back and says, look at these chickens. They're actually in the red boxes, but they're also keen to join the movement at the moment. So that's just one person. And the thing that's striking is that normally you would think in France that a prestigious poultry producer with his produce on the Élysées table in a historic moment can't make ends meet. So something you'd not think of. So one of the questions out there in the media is, are we seeing now kind of an air of revolution in France? What's the deal? That you'd pick up by Chapat, the Swiss cartoonist here. He's kind of making that parallel between 1789, the sans-culotte. The sans-culotte is like without those posh silk knickers that the 18th century bourgeoisie wore. You have the sans-culotte who were urban laborers. And there he makes the direct leap, avec gilet, with that yellow jacket, 2018. But foreign policy, the
story plays to stereotypes.
It does, yeah. But one magazine, Les Miserables versus Macron here, foreign policy is saying, no, we're not seeing that. We're not. If Macron looks in the rearview mirror and decides about his environment policy according to this looking at history, he's going to make a big mistake. What we're seeing, according to foreign policy, is not the Glums, Les Miserables versus Macron, but in fact a reshaping of the French political landscape, which is people, the equivalent actually in the article is the American Tea Party movement, saying that people are jumping into the political arena, taking ground that's available. That's the argument there. So, of course, all this is a big hit for Macron. It's being covered in Germany. Die Welt's front page there of the the Yellow Vest movement developed
A
actually...
land in yellow.
Absolutely, and a land that it sees yellow. So it's arguing basically he's in an impossible dilemma now. He gives away too much. He has a problem. If he actually plows on and actually cedes to the Yellow Vest, he's also in trouble. His back is against the wall. The result, his popularity rating, 26% today, in a poll that says François Hollande was higher in the ratings than Macron is now, 18 months into that term, the first term. So he's taking a substantial hit. Anything lower than 30 is a big hit. Even
by French standards.
Absolutely. So this article by Bruno Cotrez, a regular commentator, saying that he basically has got his work cut out now. He's facing real problems. Just to look at what direction Macron is going in, this tweet pic I want to show you here of an adaptation of that Banksy photo, perhaps a prediction of just how the direction is going, perhaps down, 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 deeper and down with the
painting that's self-destructive, right? Okay.
Is Macron about to be shredded?
All right, that's the question. Many thanks to Cliff Rushworth. There's still a ways to go. Re-election's not till what, 2022. 22, that's it. It's a 5-year mandate. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.